Well, hello, everybody. I'm Pastor Kelly Chatman with the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement, and just excited for this opportunity to do this section on asset-based community development. And I'm just so honored to be able to invite Jon Schmidt, who is a professor at Loyola University, but more importantly, I've known Jon and his lovely wife Nadine since they were in Lutheran Volunteer Corps in Washington, D.C., and we were all very much younger then. And Jon has a lot of experience with asset-based community development. And look forward to Jon providing us with an initial invitation, and we'll just take it from there. So. Again, thank you. And Jon, thank you for your time at this busy time in the university with the end of the school year and all the students. But if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and just take it away.
Thank you, Pastor Kelly. So nice to see you. And yeah, our relationship goes back to 1984. I think you were doing seminary work in DC, and Nadine and I were Lutheran volunteers, and you officiated at our wedding in 1988, and so our paths have crossed in numerous ways over the past almost 4 decades. Can we even say that? So great to see you and great to be with you. I've been at Loyola University here in Chicago for since 2014, in the School of Education as a faculty member since 2016. And a lot of my research and work and instruction is around teacher education, both graduate and undergraduate. I've done research in university community partnerships, in civic education and civic engagement and participation, and equity work. One of the recent projects we've been working on with 3 suburban high schools on developing equity strategies as their schools diversify. I came to community-based development work, asset-based community development work, actually back in '91 when I moved to Chicago and got connected with Jody Kretzman and Jon McKnight, who were kind of the godfathers of ABCD when they were at Northwestern. And so I was one of the research assistants for a couple of years with them, and contributed to the famous Green Book, Building Communities from the Inside Out. So it was really a formative experience for me in doing the research, gathering the research, and certainly has shaped my approach to work over the years. Maybe one final piece to note is that over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been a part of the university's community school initiative movement. So we have 6 community school partnerships where Loyola plays the lead partner agency. And so we definitely use an asset-based developmental approach, both there and within our School of Education. So those are just a couple things about me.
Jon, I'm throwing this at you, but a little bit about your congregational context and what you're doing with the convergence of your congregation and others.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I belong to the oldest Lutheran congregation in Chicago, founded 174 years ago, Lakeview Lutheran Church. And we happen to be in the Lakeview community where there are 4 other ELCA congregations. And so 2 years ago, under the facilitation of Pastor Stephen Bowman, we began to come together and think about, so what are 4 congregations who are not looking to merge and not looking to fold their tents, and feeling like they have some strengths and things to contribute both internally and externally to the community and the world? Are there ways that we can come together and look at our resources, look at our strengths, look at the things that we want to, like to do, or feel called to do in our congregations? And we've been having conversations for 2 years now, thinking about those questions. And this year, for example, we are thinking under the idea, the concept of hospitality, and thinking about ways that we as 4 congregations can partner on issues of service, social justice, worship, and faith formation. And it's a very interesting set of conversations. We are getting to know each other, building trust among each other, recognizing that we all have different approaches to worship and different approaches to life, but at the core, we all share something very fundamental about how we view our faith and how we view our understanding of our commitments to the world. And so it's an ongoing process. And as we get closer and closer to making connections and doing work together, we begin to realize we put our vulnerabilities forward, we put our concerns forward, and we seek ways to kind of acknowledge those, work through those, and try to understand what we can do and how we can use our resources both more effectively from an organizational standpoint, but also more powerfully from how we can be a much stronger presence on behalf of people in our congregations and as importantly in our community.
Thank you, Jon. So maybe this will be a good time, Jon, to give some more description to what is asset-based community development, and you might want to really be prepared to go deep. We've got a couple of Wartburg graduates in the participating today.
Okay. My father-in-law is 96 years old and he's a Wartburg graduate, as is his wife, yeah. And my wife, right? That's very good. So let me just do a couple of things to start with, and then I'll pause there for a second, and Kelly, if you have any follow-up questions or thoughts. And then we can come back as a way of introducing ABCD for those who aren't familiar with it, or maybe those who need a bit of a refresher. And then it can come back to talk about ways that I've / we have used this work in our context, both at our university, in our congregations, and in our community settings as well.
Great.
So let me talk about, first I want to talk about 5 elements that I think constitute asset-based community development. And the first, I think, is critical, and all of this in some ways involves a paradigm shift. But the first is that it is asset-based, right? It teaches us about ourselves, actually. It teaches us about other people, and it teaches us about our organizations and institutions. In that sometimes there's a tendency, and there's definitely this tendency in my world in education, where we tend to see first the deficits that our students bring into the class, the gaps that they have in learning. And there's all kinds of really inappropriate and sometimes really terrible ways that we've seen students in education, for example, as ridden with deficits. They can't do this, they can't do that. A more student-centered approach is, so what can the students do? What are they interested? What do they bring to the table? What are their lived experiences? And that's more an asset-based approach. And so the assets is, instead of building on a foundation of deficits, the things that are wrong, we're seeking to build on a foundation of the things that are right, the things that people can do and are doing, the things that people have an interest in and have an affinity for and have skills in. So I think that's clearly at the foundation. Making that shift from the problems, the things that people can't do, towards the strengths, the talents, the interests that people that bring. And I've always started from the premise that everybody in our environment has something that they can contribute. Everybody has something that they can bring to the table. Sometimes they just need to be asked, organized, mobilized, invited in. Secondly, the second asset that I think is really important is that it is citizen-led. And this really takes me back to when Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s was touring America, probably on horse and carriage at that point. And he was really interested in two things. He was so fascinated by the way that citizens would get together to solve their own problems, to create their own organizations, to address their own issues in their own communities. And that was something that was not as present in Europe at that time, where people were maybe more reliant on government and royalty to fix problems. He saw that differently here in American society. The other, so it was really citizens who were kind of tackling their own destiny and creating their own fates. But the other thing he saw was that America better deal with its problem of race. He named that already back in the 1830s, and so I think there's that real interesting tension between citizens who are able to address and fix problems, but also a country that was plagued by racism. So that's something that's a lens that I think we don't want to forget in this conversation as well. And he named that almost 200 years ago. A third is that it's asset-based community development is place-based. It is in neighborhoods, it is in communities, it's in organizations, it's in families. It's looking around about what do we have here in our geographic communities, or our faith communities, or our learning communities, and what do we have in these spaces that can be mobilized and organized to create something really wonderful in those spaces. Again, starting with the assets that people have in those spaces, not looking outside, not looking to downtown, not looking to the state or federal, even though they certainly have a role to play, and we can talk some about that. But looking first, what's in our place, and what kinds of work do we want to do, and who populates our spaces. The fourth is that it's partnership driven. And that is, I'm actually teaching a course right now on university, community, and school relationships. And one of the foundations of partnership work is that we need to approach it with equity and recognize the power that may be in the room. But ultimately, that 2 and 3 and 4 organizations or people working together can be far more effective and far more efficient. And it's an opportunity for people to bring their strengths to the table, and also to be part of decision making. What should we do here, and how should we do it, and how do we talk with each other about making that work happen? And then finally, it is internally focused, right? It's about what we can do in our own communities, not relying on experts. I think back to John McKnight talking so much about people being reliant on experts, somebody from outside our community to say, this is what you need. And that has had really terrible impacts, not just in our cities and country, but around the world, where the experts have said, this is what you're going to need. And he talked about within that context, this notion of bonding capital, the relationships, the social relationships and networks that people have, that bring them together, that enable them to do this work. But then also ultimately bridging capital, because sometimes we don't have all the resources that we need to do everything that we want to do. And that may be the time, after we've determined the direction that our community would like to go, that there's some bridges that we want to build outside of our community to support the work that we want to do. Should I pause there for a second? Kelly, is there anything that you'd like me to follow up on?
No, those are really helpful. But I think maybe of those, with those core kind of values of ABCD, what might be the big question that the congregation might wrestle with as they dive more deeply into this? If you could think of what's a good question to ask or challenge us to wrestle with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of times it is doing some, and I do this a lot of work with our teaching candidates. It is, before we get into the work, before we get into teaching, we have to first do some self-reflection about, so what is our starting point at this point, right? And so, for example, we talk a lot about in our ed classes, we talk a lot about social identity, and the meanings of those social identities, right? So our race, our culture, our first language, our abilities, our et cetera, our social class, right? And so what are the biases that we bring into spaces because of the identities that are social identities that have shaped us and shaped our understandings of the world, right? And so I think that, that's really important first work, is to be honest with ourselves and to be able to say, how do I view my neighbor? How do I view my community at this point in time? And the thing that I think is really critical here is the language around bias, because brain research tells us that our brain is moving way faster than we can even control, right? And so if I see somebody who's different from me, my brain is making those categorical connections really quickly. And so if I let my brain just do the work, it's getting ahead of me and maybe even ahead of where I want to be. So I need to kind of increase my awareness, ask those questions to myself. Okay, so where am I right now? Be honest with myself, and to be able then to kind of put some checks. And so that's part of, I think, the transition from, I think sometimes we can't help seeing the world in a deficit way, right? Because I think we're in some ways conditioned and socialized, and our brain helps in that process, unfortunately, right? But I think that's really important starting work before then we can say, okay, now how do we shift that paradigm now? And I think the glass half empty and the glass half full is a really good image that is often used in ABCD work, right? Shifting from that person, that community is a the community it's all this and it's all that and it's all negative, from my perspective, from what I've learned, from what I've been taught, and then beginning to make that shift. So I think that internal reflection, I think, is really important before coming into the work, because it's not I think that we begin to encounter some of the biases when we do that work, and it helps to kind of break through and see a different way of looking at the world and ourselves too, right? Sometimes we are very critical and negative about ourselves. And so I've often asked people to start with yourself. It's like, okay, list your 5 or 10 skills, interests, talents. And my freshmen in college, sometimes they struggle with that, because it's like, I haven't been taught to think that way. I've been taught to, do my studies so that I can score well on the tests, right? But I think that's it's been a really useful tool for people to begin to think of themselves in that way, and then to begin to think of the others. The next step that I would take with them is to say, okay, now that you've identified those, let's put you together with 3 or 4 other people. And here's where the partnership-driven aspect of ABCD comes in. I'm going to put you together with a group of 3 or 4 other students, and let's see how you might combine some of those talents and skills and interests together into something that might be a benefit for our community or the community, right? So that's beginning with yourself sometimes is a really good place to start, because, like I said, I think sometimes we've been socialized to critique ourselves very severely. And I think ABCD helps us to not just see others in a different light, but to see ourselves in a different light.
Yeah. Well, you haven't used this particular language, but when I think about the church, the faith community, and asset-based community development, in some ways invites and challenges us to think differently. An outcome of that is kind of liberation, right? Mm. And so, do you have some examples of how that experience from where one begins in terms of perception and the impact of the ABCD and seeing things very differently, or seeing people or communities very differently as a result of engaging in the ABCD process?
Yeah. I think that I'll use school for a second here, and then I do want to shift over to a church example. Well, I think for for a lot of our students in our School of Education don't come from Chicago. They may come from rural or suburban contexts, and yeah, I would say probably 2/3 of our students are white as well. And so they don't have a lot of experience in the city, and they don't have a lot of experience in diverse learning or living environments, right? And so when we kind of prepare the students and have these conversations to go into very diverse learning environments where the white population in the building, for example, may be 4 or 5%, and a high level of diverse learners and English language learners and refugees and immigrants. I think that preparation as they move into those spaces, helps them to really think very, very differently about the kind of relationships that they want to build and have in their classrooms, right? They see, opportunities to be in conversation and be in relationship with students. They see ways that they can structure their classrooms that really honor students and student experiences, including language and culture and ways of being and ways of knowing. So I think that's, and I love that word of liberation, right? Because I think you could probably make some really strong connections between ABCD approaches and liberation theology, because I think in some ways it liberates us to see the world in a new way. It liberates us from ourselves and the constraints that have been placed upon us. And it gives us a new way to be and act in the world that's more equitable, that's more inclusive, that's open to greater diversity. I think in our congregations, one of the things that there was a real turning point in our conversations with our 4 congregations. It's called the Lakeview Lutheran Parish. And when people began to, I usually start the conversations about what do we need for our own congregations. Somebody said, what about the people who aren't here? What about the people who we don't know yet, who could be here, right? What if we did our work based on not just us, but what if we did our work based on those who 10 years from now may be here, who we can't even name who they are right now, but creating the kinds of environments and the ways of being and the ways of thinking about the world that would be much more invitational than we are right now. So I think that was a real turning point. And so I think that in part helped us to think about, so who do we partner with? And we're right now in the process of kind of having a conversation about doing church-based organizing work and creating an alliance with one of our neighborhood organizations that does really good organizing. And it's interesting because, it's a little bit scary. There's a deep commitment there. And so we're taking some time with that. We're not jumping into it too quickly, but we're beginning to create opportunities for people to think outside the congregations, as we have testified that we want to be able to do that. And that's one way to do that. So I think that's one way that, we're thinking about that, but also thinking about it from really an asset perspective, that we're not the only ones who can solve problems, nor should we be the only ones. There are partners out there that we want to be in deeper relationship with, and out of that I think comes really interesting innovation and opportunities for being with people, but also doing the kinds of work that maybe we never anticipated we have ever thought we could do. And I think that's really the cool thing, because if we stay within ourselves, we're limited. But if we do open ourselves to those partnerships, by virtue of us being in conversation with each other and discussion with each other and brainstorming and generating ideas, it takes us into places that maybe we didn't anticipate. And I found that a lot of times those are really interesting, fun, but productive places to be.
I love this. This is just great. I know that part of this process that Pastor Brandon is doing a reflection on the feeding of the 5,000, and listening to you, I'm imagining that maybe that story didn't just happen as efficiently as we think, that maybe Jesus was having a conversation about asset-based community development before they started distributing the food, that it might be a far more expansive way of being community
Yeah.
than the disciples had thought. So
Yeah.
this
I
is
mean, I
great.
think a couple of things that are happening there for me from an ABCD perspective, right? The first is that the disciples are kind of like, that's not going to happen. We can't do this. What are we going to do? So they didn't trust themselves and their own capacities, right? But then the next thing is they didn't trust themselves to ask other people to be part of the solution. Right, which I think is really interesting as well. So kind of two things happening for them, and all the while Jesus is kind of like, yeah, this is going to work out. We just have to trust ourselves.
Uh, and I think about our context in the story and your stories is how it really is. It opens up imagination.
Yeah.
That things could be very different than they are now. And that's a big challenge because we're not oriented to be the imaginative people that maybe God invites us to be.
Yeah. Kelly, I think that's so powerful, and that has played such an important role in my life. And it may just be me, but I think there are other people out there as well that really like and appreciate being in those generative spaces. Right. And I know I've been in partnerships where that are primarily transactional. Right? Can Loyola do this for me? And I'm kind of like, yeah, but that's not really that's not the only thing that I'm interested in. Right. I'm really interested in generating some really interesting ideas and approaching some problems and thinking about some solutions that really involve us. Not just you and me kind of putting this thing together, but involving people at all layers of the organization so that they feel included. And that in generating those ideas, like I said, a lot of times it's kind of like this never could have happened if we didn't see each other on mutual terms and in mutually beneficial ways, towards generating something new that we're going to have to work at to sustain, but so valuable because each of us carry something very deep with us that has contributed to whatever that looks like. And I think that makes all the difference in the world when the ownership in the solution or the strategy is widespread and people feel a personal investment in that. That's when I think you begin to get excitement and sustainability, and it becomes more than a service that we've provided for other people, right? It's something that we've done together and benefited together equally.
Yeah.
We're not just kind of doling out things for other people. We're doing some really interesting, life-giving, liberating work together.
Well, Jon, thank you. One of the things that you remind me of is when we talk about our role as disciples and witnesses of God, that we frame that as co-creators. And so much of what you're articulating really fits into that framework of co-creation, stewards of God's creation. So, Jon, this has been wonderful. Is there anything that you would want to add? And, the challenge of this is we'd love to do more.
Always. I would just say that there's so much, and I experience this in so many ways. And I'm going on 60, right? So I've been around for a few years and been in communities for a lot of those years. And so I'm always just really intrigued and delighted, and sometimes astonished by what we don't see. And how delighted my students are when we go through the community and see these just gems that nobody knows they're there. Most people don't know they're there, right? And so I think that's just their laughter and I want to do that and I want to do that, right? And so I think that's part of the real joy of a because I think we see the Targets and we see the restaurants and we see the churches and we see the schools, but we don't see so much of what is going on in our communities, right? And so the communities from an ABCD perspective, I think, organizations and institutions, which may or may not be visible to us, but associations, right? Informal gatherings of citizens, whether it's a men's drumming group or a reading group or a knitting group or whatever it is, right? They're out there in our communities, and that's and then the spaces that are there, and the individuals, and the stories, and the cultures, and the histories. I think those are all the assets that we can access and dream with and find joy in as we uncover those, because I think a lot of times those are really hidden to us as we go about our work and go about our day. But a congregation or an organization that says we're really interested in getting to know that and creating partnerships and mobilizing those folks together, that's really powerful, but also very life-giving. And I'll come back to that word of liberating as well. I think it's a beautiful thing.
Oh, well, thank you. And Jon, the wonderful thing about this too is that our congregations also get to be a part of that reciprocal relationship. The community gets to see how wonderful we are, right?
Yep.
And the wonderful things happening in our community. So it really does go both ways. So,
100%.
This has been great. Thank you so much, Jon. People of Easter, have at it. Thank you, and blessings on the rest of the meeting.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Good to see you.
And I'm just wondering if you could comment on the idea of doing asset mapping. How should one think about that approach?
Yeah, I'm surprised I didn't say it because it is part of what we do, right? And I think there's lots of different ways to do it. I think there definitely is an internal asset mapping process that's really important. The one that starts with ourselves and starts with members. And I think that's a really good way to get going, actually, right? Because we tend not to have these kinds of conversations. We may know that Kelly is a great preacher or Dan is great with technology. But there's so much other stuff about ourselves that we don't know. And so I think and then maybe here borrowing from community organizing where they do one-on-ones, right? Encouraging people in congregations, starting there to, get to know each other and have these kinds of conversations and get to know and share what people love to do that too, right? Love to share what they're good at, love to share what they're interested in. And so I think that process can be really valuable. We have our students do, place the school, a school in our communities at the center of an asset map. And then the challenge for them is as an activity is for them to say, okay, what are within a 1 mile radius, what are some of the really interesting organizations and associations that you can identify? Learn more about that organization, do a couple of interviews within that organization and see what they have. And then we do an analysis at the end of that process. And there's some tools to help you do this, and I can share some of that with you if you don't have them already. I imagine you probably do. But then the analysis for them is to say, okay, given this set of assets, which of those could be mobilized to bring some resources and supports into a school, right? So not to say that we're trying to fix the school, because we're doing the same kind of asset work with students and parents at the same time. But, last year, the parents and teachers, et cetera, were naming health as a really important issue. And so what are the health resources that we can bring together? And so that asset mapping process resulted in a really fabulous community health fair that we did last week, where we had dozens and dozens of families and community members come to it. But that all started, from the students doing a mapping inventory to say, what are the health resources in our community that we know about, that we don't know about, and let's start to be in relationship with them.